person if you've never met him before. His name is Robert Muller. He may not be as well known as some of the rest of these men, but he may be the most powerful of the bunch, because Robert Muller has been known as the prophet of the United Nations. He has written much literature, and he projects where we should go next in our trip toward one world government. Inevitably, his suggestions have been followed. I have most all of his books, and I am absolutely astounded when I read his books, and some of the things that he wrote 10 years ago are being implemented right now. Mr. Robert Muller was Assistant Secretary General to 3 Secretary Generals. He worked at the United Nations for 38 years. He now has left the UN and is serving as the Chancellor for the University of Peace, which is a UN university in Costa Rica. We have interviewed Robert Muller 3 different times, and it's interesting some of the things that Mr. Robert Muller has done. In particular, he wrote a book in 1991 called The Birth of a Global Civilization. Do you recognize it? In 92, Strobe Talbot wrote an article, The Birth of a Global Nation. And he said in his article exactly what the prophet of the United Nations had set in motion when he wrote his book, The Birth of a Global Civilization. He also wrote another book called The New Genesis, Shaping a Global Spirituality, because Robert Muller told me we have brought the world together as far as we can politically. If we're going to have global unity and true peace and security upon earth, it has to assume a spiritual dimension. He's telling me this. He doesn't know what I'm thinking. I don't want him to know what I'm thinking. But I'll tell you what I'm thinking. I'll tell you now. I'm thinking about the fact that there's an Antichrist and a false prophet that work together to bring the world together into the end time prophesied one world government. It's very clearly depicted in Revelation chapter 13 and in other places. And I'm listening to this man talk, saying, we've got the United Nations, it's done a good job, but we need a United Religions organization. He told me this before I ever heard there was one being formed, but the prophet of the UN told me. And then I heard 3 years later that it had been launched. I'll tell you a little bit more about that in just a moment. Now, let's learn a little bit more about Robert Muller. Robert Muller authored the World Core Curriculum because he believes that in order to have world unity, you have to have people trained to think right. Consequently, he dreamed of devising a curriculum for all students of the world to study. And there are many schools around the world now that are called Robert Muller schools because they use his World Core Curriculum, which he personally authored. Now, here's what's so interesting. He credits his inspiration to the teachings of 2 people, Alice Bailey and the Tibetan teacher Djwhal Khul. And he used their teachings as the basis for his World Core Curriculum, which he wants every one of your children to go through so that they can become good global citizens in the emerging New World Order that Marie Strong is designing the United Nations to rule over. And we're going to see a little bit about Alice Bailey. If Alice Bailey is inspiring Robert Muller, the prophet of the UN, to give guidance to Marie Strong, and he is also influencing Strobe Talbot, who is the former roommate of our president right now, and probably the most influential person in our State Department right now. When all of this is coming together and Mr. Muller is giving credit for inspiration to Alice Bailey, we probably should know who Alice Bailey is, and you're not going to believe what I'm going to tell you. Alice Bailey was the founder of a publishing company called Lucifer's Publishing Company. Have you ever heard of Lucifer, by the way? Now, this wasn't easy to market, Lucifer's Publishing Company. Some people had an aversion to buying things from Lucifer's Publishing Company. I don't know whether you would buy anything from Lucifer's Publishing Company or not. I personally would not. So she decided to change the name to Lucis Trust. And it just happens to be headquartered at the United Nations Plaza. But we're broad-minded at the United Nations. After all, Maurice Strong has a Zen Buddhist temple and many other New Age worship centers on his ranch in Colorado, and he has been entrusted by the powers that be, by the men who rule the world, to shape global government, to run all of our lives into the emerging 21st century. So he credits Alice Bailey with inspiration. He also credits Djwal Khul. Now this gets even more interesting because Djwal Khul does not exist. There is no such creature. Alice Bailey claims that's her spirit guide who comes to her during meditation and gives her inspiration for Lucifer's publishing company materials. Wait a minute, this can't be true. Are you telling me that Robert Muller credits his inspiration to Lucifer's publishing company and a spirit guide, a Tibetan teacher by the name of Djwal Khul, who comes in mystical clouds to Alice Bailey while she meditates? And Robert Muller then writes books that Strobe Talbot reads and says U.S. sovereignty will cease to exist. In the 21st century, we will all answer to a single global authority. The mystery of iniquity doth already work. And it sounds like to me it's picking up steam. You have to know this. I don't know whether you remember or not that Ted Turner felt like that the young people of America should have a good knowledge of current events. This was about 10 years or so ago. So he made this magnanimous decision to take all the money that all of us pay him for piping CNN and other things into homes. He decided to take all that money, and at least part of that money, and put a television set in every classroom in America so that your children could be educated. The only stipulation when he did this was that they would be required to watch between 10 and 20 minutes of current events every day. Supplied, of course, by Ted Turner and CNN. So in this master stroke, he gained access to the minds of all your children. And he has been doing this every day faithfully. Every day faithfully. Why in the world would he go to such trouble? Just because he loves your kids? Or is there a global agenda? Is there a vision of one world government? Could it be that the mystery of iniquity, all of this is satanic inspired? There's much scripture that it is.